Hello friends, Adam here with FED. Today we're going to take a look at every Fire Emblem game in the series and decide which games are the easiest and which are the hardest, and we're going to be ranking them accordingly. I am not going to be assuming this is a blind playthrough. I'm going to be assuming these are, for second, third, fourth playthroughs. You kind of know, you already know what's going on in the game, you're prepared for it, and we are going to be considering the hardest difficulty in each game. So, let us get started. So, the first game, FE1. Shadow Dragon, the Blade of Light. I think it is honestly pretty easy. I'm going to put it into easy tier, especially, again, assuming this isn't your first playthrough, you know how the game works. It's really easy to break Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light with stat boosters. Stat boosters are really overpowered in Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. You throw them onto Marth or Jagan, you just kind of win. And just overall, enemies are pretty weak compared to your units and stuff. I just think that game is honestly pretty easy, so we're going to put it there. Gaiden, I think, is even easier. Endless grinding plus just really strong Alm is busted. Celic is pretty good. When your main characters are really good, it helps the game be honestly pretty easy. Alright, next, New Mystery. I keep calling it New Mystery whenever I mention this game. Mystery of the Emblem. I've been playing New Mystery recently. Mystery of the Emblem, FE3, I think is like baseline difficulty for Fire Emblem, which is fitting. I think it also is kind of just like baseline Fire Emblem as a whole. I feel like Mystery of the Emblem is where Intelligent Systems really like honed in on what the core ideals of Fire Emblem are and what makes Fire Emblem, and we got it right here. And I really like that about it. And I also think it's just a good like baseline difficulty in the series. I think it's just like average difficulty, and it kind of hits a sweet spot, in my opinion. All right, next we have Genealogy of the Holy War. If this were a blind playthrough, I'd probably put it as a little harder than like FE1 and FE2, but I don't know. I'm tempted to throw it into average, or maybe the top of easy. I think we'll throw it into the bottom of average for now. I think Genealogy of the Holy War is honestly really easy. Sigurd is busted as crap, and you get him from the beginning. And then Gen 2, Seliph is also busted, but you also have so many other characters that can just take care of the game for you if you let them. So actually, I'm going to put it into easy tier. Genealogy is honestly, again, on second, third, fourth playthrough, is pretty much a cakewalk, and it allows for a lot of experimentation, and you can make pairings that you want or do no pairings and do a substitute run. I think Genealogy is great that way, but it is pretty easy. I will say that. There's basically there's no problem with just throwing like 2 or 3 characters into a ginormous mess of enemies and just winning. You can even do it in the final map with like Seliph and stuff. Certain characters are just so busted that it doesn't matter. So I think easy is fair. All right. Next we have Thracia 776. And I'm tempted to throw this into average because once you know what this game is going to throw at you, it's honestly pretty average on difficulty. On a blind playthrough, I think it's pretty hard because you don't know anything that's coming. You're not prepared for like warp tiles and whatever else. But I think I'm going to throw it into... we'll throw it into hard. Maybe it'll move down to average later on. But I think... Thracia does up the difficulty from Mystery of the Emblem and especially Genealogy in that characters and enemies are often on equal footing in terms of stats. Just because stat caps are so low, you don't get this big like jump or advantage in stats even in like the early game that you would get in like Genealogy of the Holy War, and that really makes especially the early game a little more difficult, and even the end game is still difficult because of, again, the stat caps being so low that enemy scaling actually does catch up to the player, whereas in a lot of games in the series, they really don't. So I think hard is fair for Thracia. All right. So Binding Blade hard mode. This one is a tough one as well. Tempted to go bottom of hard. We'll say bottom of hard for Binding Blade hard mode. It's honestly pretty difficult. You are given Marcus at the beginning, but he does fall off pretty quick. Really, the things that keep the game from being like super difficult is you are given characters pretty early that can be pretty reliable boss killers. namely Rucker and other solid units. So I think hard is fair, potentially top of average. We'll see where we land though. All right, Blazing Blade FE7 definitely goes into easy tier. I'm not sure where it would go, but I'm going to put it there for now. Really, even on Hector hard mode, it is honestly not that difficult. The game kind of, I'll be honest, it gives you like this character that's stupid strong and you just win. Marcus is so good, especially early game, and then even late game he's serviceable. But by the time you get to late game, you should have other units who can just also destroy the game for you. And even if you are playing on the hardest difficulty and like maybe you don't have units that are ready for the final chapter or something, guess what? You get Athos, and Athos is good enough to just, I'm sure people have done it, just solo the final chapter with Athos, but even if you don't solo it, you can just take out an enemy on player phase if you need him to. And it gives you other characters like Pent is really good, Hake is super good, Jafar late game, even though he does come pretty late, is like super useful. There's so many good characters in Blazing Blade that it's hard for me to say that it's anything but easy tier. Alright, next we have Sacred Stones, which I'm going to throw into the easiest game in the series. Now, you could argue that other games deserve to be here, namely like Gaiden or Blazing Blade, but Sacred Stones just has extremely powerful characters, relatively weak enemies, and just endless grinding if you want it. It really just makes the game kind of a cakewalk. And then on top of that, all that, even though like every character is really good, or can become really good, I should say, you start with the best character in the game. Chapter 1, you know, the prologue, Seth is ready to go and can just destroy the game for you. I mean, would I recommend doing that? No, it's not. I don't think that's fun, but you can do that. So I think just because of Seth's existence and then every other character's viability, that it just makes Sacred Stones about as easy as it gets in the series. Okay, Path of Radiance. So I had a hard time deciding whether I was going to rank Path of Radiance on the hardest Japanese difficulty or on the hardest American difficulty or international release difficulty. And I decided ultimately to go with the hardest international release just because Maniac mode honestly doesn't feel like the greatest greatest mode for that game. And even on difficult mode, Fire Emblem Path of Radiance is pretty easy. I would argue that it's a little harder than like Genealogy of the Holy War, but not by much. I'm going to throw it into average tier. I think, again, it's like a baseline difficulty. You're just given a lot of strong characters as well, but the enemies scale with you a little better, in my opinion, than in, say, Sacred Stones. And ultimately, it just makes the game a little more difficult. And there's all just like kind of a... like there's chapters like Clash, like chapter 27, that 27 or that 20, I think that's 26. Chapter 28, which is actually pretty difficult with all the feral Lagoos. Endgame isn't a cakewalk. The final boss is actually pretty tough, but they do give you like Tabarn or Gifka if you want, so it makes it a little easier. I just think the game can be hard, but there's a lot of counterbalances to make it easier than it otherwise would be if you weren't given those countermeasures. Okay, Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn hard mode. I think that definitely goes within the ranks of the hard games. Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn on hard mode, the first 10 chapters, so part 1 is pretty brutal, right? But once you get past that, it kind of eases up because you get some really good units with Joffrey, Alencia, Kieran, Har, of course, and then you get into part 3 with the Grail Mercenaries, and pretty much everyone in the Grail Mercenaries is really good, save for maybe like Mist and Rolf. And then you move from there back to the Dawn Brigade in part 3, chapter 6, and they are abysmally bad. They are horrid. They are bad. They're just like not good. They're bad guys. Like they just aren't caught up at all unless you like really grind them and stuff. And their chapters are doable, don't get me wrong, but it's brutal. It is brutal. Fog of War plus Lagoos, and you have to kill a certain amount of them, and also just survive. And you have dumb partner units, yellow units that aren't like the smartest, and you have to like, guide them. I don't know. It's a whole thing. Difficult chapter. And then just a few chapters later, in was it 312, you have the defense map, or is it 313? It's 313. 313 is the defense map with the Dawn Brigade again. 312 is actually another map where we have to kill a certain amount of enemies, and it's not that bad. But 313 can be pretty brutal, especially if you don't have a set plan ready to go, or if you don't have at least a few Dawn Brigade units trained up ready to handle Lagoos. It's a brutal chapter, so I think for that alone, Radiant Dawn is harder than the average Fire Emblem game, just because Part 3 is so brutal to the Dawn Brigade. Alright, Shadow Dragon. Now we're getting into the real meat of it, the toughest of the tough in my opinion, for some of these. So Shadow Dragon Hard 5, the hardest difficulty, is definitely up in the one of the hardest games, one of the hardest game modes in the entire series. It is absolutely brutal. Enemies are almost always stronger than you. Your units rarely, very rarely, one-round KO, which is honestly a pretty common occurrence in most other Fire Emblem games. And oh man, you can just get romped if you don't know what you're doing on Hard 5. Really relies on using effective weaponry and forging them and using them well. It really makes what's cool about it is it makes characters like Sita really shine, but it is just monstrously brutal. The enemies are really tough. Alright, New Mystery of the Emblem, FE12, I think is probably the hardest game in the series. Because of Lunatic Reverse. So Lunatic Reverse, it is a terribly strong difficulty where the enemies are just buff as crap, but also reverse mode, meaning the enemy always attacks first if they can. So if they can counter, they will always attack first. It's just a whole like mind-bending thing that you have to wrap your head around that you just aren't used to when you play Fire Emblem, and it messes with you, man. It messes with you. So I think for now we're going to put it as the hardest game in the series. It is honestly stupid difficult. Again, that's assuming the hardest difficulty. Like, honestly, even for like blind playthrough, I don't think you could do it. Like, I'm sure someone has. Like, some maniac did a blind playthrough of Reverse Lunatic and was like, yeah, I did it, whatever. After lots of trial and error, but no, it's hard, man. It's difficult stuff. Alright. Awakening. Lunatic Plus is another one that I considered to maybe put as the hardest game in the series. It becomes the Robin solo, and you do have Frederick to lean on kind of in the early game, but that's not even like enough. The enemies are so strong. They have stupid skills like 100% hit, or they always have Vantage and stuff like that. Like, just gives enemies terrifying skills. It makes them just like super high stats, and basically makes it so that your units will get destroyed by them unless you unless you specifically use like Robin to his fullest potential or her fullest potential. You know, just go for the Krobin solo, you know, the Crom Robin solo. That's my understanding, at least. I personally have never actually played this difficulty because I heard it's stupid and I didn't really care to play it. It is really hard, though, to my understanding. So I'm going to put it there. For all I know, it might be the hardest, but we're going to put it there. Alright, Birthright Lunatic. I'm going to put that into... I think I'm going to put it into average, actually. Maybe the hardest average. I think Birthright is honestly... endless grinding plus Ryoma equals a game that isn't that hard. In all honesty, you can always get to a point where you're going to win. You have so many really good characters in Birthright. And, you know, Korn's really good, of course. I already mentioned Ryoma. And then, of course, like Takumi, Hinoka, they're all fine too. And if you really need it, you have like early game Jacob as a paladin or something. Just really breaks the game open. I think even on the hardest difficulty, it's pretty average in terms of difficulty. But I could be wrong on that. That's my opinion. Conquest Lunatic, I think, is like par with Radiant Dawn Lunatic, or Radiant Dawn Hard Mode. I think it has the potential to be like the hardest if you don't know what you're doing, and if you don't pay attention to skills. Conquest Lunatic really just hits you really hard with enemy skill builds that are terrifying, and a lot of dagger units that debuff you. So that's like the big issue, but you're given, again, pretty strong characters like Camilla and Xander that can really mitigate some of the difficulty. But I still think it's just overall harder than Birthright, just because of the lack of endless grinding, more than anything. Okay, Revelation. I don't know. I've actually never played Revelation Lunatic. I probably never will because I don't really care to. So I'm not sure how bad it gets, but I can't imagine it's any harder than Birthright. So we're just gonna put it there. Echo's hard mode. Fire Emblem Echo's hard mode is probably one of my least favorite modes in the series. And here's why. So normal mode for Echoes is honestly pretty fun. I enjoy it. But what hard mode does is it just like, I feel like it just really ups enemy bulk. Enemies end up just having extreme amounts of HP. And that's what keeps you from one round KOing. And that's what makes enemies dangerous, is that you can't just kill them in one turn. It's honestly really frustrating, but I think beyond that, it's fairly easy. I don't think it's that hard, and I think, and again, there's still endless grinding, and you still have Alm, who's really good. You still have characters like I don't know, Gray's really good early as a mercenary with 11 sword or something. There's ways to make it easier than it is, than it would be otherwise. So I think throwing this into easy is fair. I mean, some people might not agree with me, but that's where I'm going to put it. All right. Three Houses Maddening mode. Three Houses Maddening, I'm going to say, and like, I'm not going to really pick a route, but maybe I would reference Silver Snow as the hardest, in my opinion. I think Three Houses Maddening Silver Snow is just stupid hard. I don't think it's nearly as hard as, say, Awakening, Lunatic Plus, or Hard 5 Shadow Dragon, but I would say it's probably harder than Radiant Dawn. And that being said, I think I'm going to move Conquest above Radiant Dawn too. Three Houses Maddening, what's really hard about it is the early game, and then the mid game really kind of like is where your characters start to hit their stride and kind of become just a little better than the enemy. But then end game, the enemies are caught up or better than you, and they just like can jack you up super hard if you're not ready. I'm talking sword masters with quick riposte and like 50 something speed, assassins with like 60 speed or something stupid, falcon knights with lance fair, sword breaker, and a bazillion speed. These enemies that are just horribly hard to hit. And horribly hard to like not get destroyed by. Like you have to really play around these enemies. Like you never double, you always get doubled. It can be brutal, especially if you don't know what you're doing. But I think the thing that really makes Three Houses hard is you aren't given an early game unit that really can just kind of baby you into getting comfortable, or baby you into getting your smaller units into a position where they can contribute, like weaker units. I mean, like in Path of Radiance, you have Titania, and Titania just kind of can just mitigate any problems you have if you really want her to. She can always kill something if you need her to, and she can always tank if you need her to in the early game. The same kind of goes for Radiant Dawn early game Soth, except to a lesser extent. I don't think Soth is as good as like Titania was or Seth was, but still really good. And then in Three Houses, you have like no one. Byleth is the closest thing you get to a quote-unquote Jagan character. So yeah. And now to round it off, just for fun, because I love Tearing Saga. I know it's not technically a Fire Emblem, but it was made by the guy who made Fire Emblem, and if you play it, it's basically Fire Emblem. It's like Fire Emblem and everything but name. And I think it is about as easy as it gets, honestly. I don't think it's easier than Sacred Stones, but it's close. There are a few things that might catch you off guard, like there's some dragons and stuff in the late game that are really tough if you're not ready for them. Like they'll straight up just murder you if you're not ready for them. Like the chapter in particular I'm thinking of is when Runen gets his personal weapon. It's just like there's this giant brick of dragons that you have to kill, and they're terrifying. But luckily you're given tools. There's character. You're given the tools to do it. Namely, Runen's personal sword does effective damage against dragons or at the very least it ignores their dragon skin item. And then you just have other characters that are really powerful in Tearing Saga. So that's where we'll leave that. I think overall I'm pretty happy with this list. I don't think I would change anything at this point. I think Awakening could potentially trade places with New Mystery of the Emblem, and Tearing Saga could potentially trade places with Sacred Stones. But as far as, actually, I think Sacred Stones is so straightforward, and Tearing Saga does have a thing or two that could trip you up if you don't prepare for them correctly. But again, this is assuming you've played the game before, so you probably wouldn't. Regardless, I think this is a pretty good tier list. This is what I like to see, I think. But let me know in the comments, what would you change? What games do you think are easier than others? Which ones do you think are harder? What would you move? And let me know what's your hardest and what's your easiest game in the series. I'd be interested to hear it. And thanks for watching, guys. Really appreciate it. Make sure just to subscribe if you haven't, and like the video for visibility purposes. Thanks, guys.